I don't tell this story often, because even in the 2020s, when it's less and less acceptable to victim blame, I don't like having to answer questions like, well, what time was it? Or, what were you wearing? I went to college in a sleepy town near the US-Mexico border. With 100,000 people, it was small enough to know many people around, but big enough that the new faces didn't really stand out much. I like to frequent this walking trail that ran alongside a main road in town. The street was well driven, and the path well used by runners, walkers, bikers, and people out with their strollers. Unless you're there near 11 at night, like I was the last time I ever walked it. I was about half a mile away from home. I had my headphones plugged in, and was walking to clear my head of some particularly stubborn anxiety. Ironically, fear that something bad was going to happen to me. A car, I can't tell you what kind it was, slowed down as they saw me. At the time, I could have sworn it was a black Mustang, specifically just like the one a friend of mine drove. I approached the car thinking it was that very same friend. You know, it was a smallish town, not uncommon to run into them while out and about. As I got a bit closer though, I could tell right away this was not my friend. It was a man I'd never seen before. Shaved head, glasses, some sort of yellow graphic t-shirt. I distinctly remember he looked like my Uncle Dan. I stopped in place, even took a step back actually. I could see his lips were moving, but I couldn't quite hear what he was saying. Being the painfully polite person I was, I took a step closer to hear him better. Now I could make out him saying something about the word campus. Was he asking for directions to the campus? He nodded affirmatively. Well, which campus are you looking for, sir? The community college or the university? He stumbled about, clearly not having prepared enough to know he would be asked this simple question. He stammered out the name of the university in a way that made my head tell me he clearly had never even been there. Nonetheless, I told him he wasn't far away. He would need to turn around and go straight 3 or 4 miles. He began to mumble more words to himself that I still couldn't make out. I called out to him once more. What are you trying to say, sir? My heart was pounding. I could tell something was off about this guy, but I didn't quite know what it was. I'd been staring at his face this whole time trying to figure it out. It wasn't until I took one last step forward that I noticed the way his hand was sitting and what he was holding in his lap. He flashed his handgun at me. As soon as he saw I'd noticed it, he said in a now perfectly audible voice, "Get in the car now!" I completely froze. I couldn't run, I couldn't scream. Most assuredly I wouldn't comply. I just stopped functioning altogether. Again, this time he flashed his gun directly at me. "Get in the fucking car!" He was getting nervous now. His hand was twitching on the trigger. To this day, I can't explain why my brain chose to have me turn around and run away from the car. I heard the car start behind me, and somehow I knew this would be the end for me. He was turning around to get me. I couldn't bear to watch. Nobody would come to help me if I screamed. I was all alone now. I stopped running and just walked, resigned. In that moment, I had given up altogether. I can't really tell you why. Instead of turning around though, he noticed another car coming down the road and slammed down on the gas and fled, leaving me there shaking, a profoundly vulnerable mess. Enough wit returned after a minute or so for me to call 911. Some cop cars showed up shortly thereafter, and they took my statement. I remember thinking the cops didn't believe me. One said I was pretty calm for someone who was almost abducted. I was even feebly making jokes. For months after that, I scoured the internet, looking for news stories about missing women or attempted abductions, hoping I would find a mugshot with his face on it. But I never did find one. That means there's a chance he's still out there, going to college towns he has no business in, asking for directions, looking like people's uncles. As for me, I'd be glad to never have to interact with him again. This is more of a warning to people who live alone than anything else, but the memory of it still creeps the ever-loving shit out of me. A few years back, I lived in an apartment complex. It was not in a particularly bad part of town either. In fact, I'd lucked out even, somehow managing to move into the same building as a handful of friends of mine. I thought this was perfect. A couple of months after living there, though, I started to notice some things going missing. It was never anything big like my laptop or my Xbox or my TV. It would be smaller things. An iPod, a disposable camera, a couple of other small things just vanishing here and there. I'd often knew I'd left them out in the open on the counter or something, but then they'd just be gone. I figured I'd just misplaced them, because again, they were fairly small items. A few times I'd get ready to leave, only to find my bottom lock already locked. Now, personally, I don't put much stock in doorknob locks. They're fairly flimsy and easy to pick anyway, and not really worth the effort. I only really ever use deadbolts and the like. When people would come over, I'd close the door behind them and lock the deadbolt, of course. That was a reflex, even when I was home alone. That part of the door would be locked, but I'd never lock the knob itself. I just felt safer that way. The deadbolt had no keyhole on the other side of the door for someone to pick or anything like that, after all. 3 times I noticed the doorknob was locked when I went to leave the house, even though I myself never used it. I rationalized that perhaps when going to lock the deadbolt, I just locked that too out of instinct. I mean, what else could it be? Well, one day, after living there for about 7 months now, I'm just sitting there in my living room when I hear some shuffling by my front door. Since my apartment was a 1-bedroom and fairly small, I could easily hear this through the walls. I got up and moved a bit closer, standing maybe 4 feet away from the door. My heart immediately sank as I watched the doorknob begin to twist ever so slowly. It turned and turned, and then the door pushed in, only to be stopped in place by my deadbolt. At an agonizingly slow pace, the person on the other side of the door pulled it closed. They clicked it softly shut, and I watched and listened as they slid a key into my lock and locked the doorknob themselves. I didn't know what to do. Have you ever seen something that just restarts your brain? It's so unfathomable that you just can't take in any more information in the moment. That's exactly what this was. I wish I could say I snuck up to the door and banged against it, scaring the shit out of whoever was on the other side. But of course, that's not what happened. I didn't do anything because my brain couldn't actually comprehend that someone with a key was trying to get into my apartment while I was still home. The only thing that had saved me in that moment was my deadbolt. And before anyone suggests it was one of my aforementioned friends or my husband with a spare key or something, no, I had the only 2 copies of my key because my husband was deployed at the time. Not even my family had a spare. Everything sort of snapped into place after that. Someone had been sneaking into my apartment, stealing my shit and doing God knows what while I was gone, then locking the door behind them. They'd attempted to do this while I was there too, locking my doorknob. How many times had they been in my apartment when I wasn't home? There was no way for me to know, because like I said before, I can't lock the deadbolt from outside. Logically, I knew it had to be someone who worked in the office, a maintenance man most likely, but since I hadn't looked through the peephole in that moment, I couldn't figure out which of the 4 guys who worked there it was. Crazily enough, about 6 months after finally moving out, a friend who still lived there told me that all of the maintenance men had been fired because all of them were reported for creeping around apartments and suspected of stealing as well. While this might not be outright terrifying like some stories, it's still pretty scary. Another reminder to always lock your doors in multiple ways, even when you're already home. So when I was probably in 2nd or 3rd grade, we had an early dismissal. For those of you who don't know, that's when school goes on for longer than half a day, but we still get out an hour or so early. I remember sitting silently in class, working on some math problems, when the phone rang. I joked to my friend next to me that I hoped it was for me. We all watched the teacher answer the phone because we knew that 90% of the time it meant someone was leaving class. When the teacher's eyes met with mine, suddenly I got pretty worried. I was an anxious kid, so immediately I thought someone must have died. My teacher said something into the phone and then asked me, "When are you getting off the bus today?" I thought this was a pretty weird question. My mom already knew when I would be getting home because she had to leave work early so she'd be there when I got there. I told my teacher the normal time. My teacher spoke for a few more seconds, then hung up the phone. I asked her what that was all about, and she told me my parent just wanted to double check what time I got off. I didn't really think too much about it for the rest of the day. Later on, when I got off the bus, I walked home without much incident. When I walked to the front door, my mom asked me about my day and took my coat. I remember the exact look on her face when I asked her, "Why did you call the school to see what time I was getting off the bus?" She looked shocked. She said she hadn't called the school. I told her the whole story, and immediately she started making frantic phone calls. I knew right away something was wrong. I sat down and watched some TV while my mom talked up a storm. About 20 minutes later, my stepdad arrived home early from work. About 10 minutes after that, a state trooper pulled up as well. I was pretty scared at this point. I thought somehow I was going to be in trouble. The trooper asked me a few questions, such as, "Has anyone ever tried to talk to you while you've walked from the bus stop? Have you ever seen anyone park there who didn't have a kid get into their car? Has anyone ever tried to give you a ride?" The answer to all these questions was no. I'd never seen anyone suspicious, as we lived in a pretty nice neighborhood and it was mostly old retired folk who lived around us. My mom asked me to go upstairs and pack a bag, as it was my dad's weekend for visitation. When my dad got there to pick me up, he was questioned pretty heavily by the trooper as well. I eavesdropped from upstairs. My mom called me back down and I left with my dad for the weekend. My dad taught me some basic self-defense, which I thought was pretty cool. I never heard anything else about the situation, and eventually I forgot about it. Fast forward to today. I've been listening to some creepy narrations on YouTube. When I suddenly remembered this whole incident, I asked my mom about it, and what she told me chilled me to my core. She told me that day, someone had called the school pretending to be my dad. This man knew my dad's full name, my full name, and all the details about my mother as well. He kept on saying my mother had told him to pick me up from the bus stop because she wasn't going to be able to leave work early. The school didn't even bother calling my mother. The only thing that saved me that day from being abducted was the fact I had told that man I'd be getting off the bus at the normal time, which was around 3:15. But because it was a shorter day, I actually got off the bus around 1:45. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, but it still gives me nightmares. I was at the time attending a college that was only about a 10-minute walk away from my Nana's apartment. In between classes, I would walk over to visit her because of this. This was in a fairly sketchy part of town, so I would dress fairly frumpy. Sweatpants, an oversized sweatshirt, and always keeping my hood up and covering my face. I figured if I wore nothing attractive or flashy and was as plain as possible, I'd give off the message of "don't bother me." My mistake was thinking that in the middle of the day, no one would try to do anything. I was not calling attention to myself, so I figured I'd be practically invisible. But boy, was that wrong. I was just leaving her house and heading back to campus when I noticed this plain blue van slowly driving right next to me. It was a man who seemed to be asking me directions to a well-known hotel that had giant signs posted all over the side of the road. I didn't answer him because of this, and instead kept my head down, walking a bit quicker away from his car. At that point, I saw him pull into the parking lot near us to turn his car off and hop out. Now he ran up to me, walking next to me. He said I was pretty and started asking me the usual questions. "What's your name? Know any places to party? Why are you being so shy? Don't you need a ride?" I don't know why I decided to do this. I probably thought if I acted like I was real tough, he would just leave me alone. I stopped walking, turned around and looked him in the face and said, Take a hint, you bastard. If I'm not answering you, it means leave me alone." The look he gave me in that moment sent chills down my spine. His eyes grew extremely wide, and he looked at me with this expressionless face. In a cold, emotionless tone, he said, "Okay, little girl, we'll see." He walked away, staring at me the whole time. I saw him jump in his car, only to fly out of the parking lot in the opposite direction. I felt a bit relieved, seeing as how I'd seen him drive away, and continued on my route. As I was crossing the road, though, the same van came screeching towards me. He drove up onto the sidewalk right in front of me, nearly running me over and blocking my path. "Get in the van now!" I was frozen in fear. I was terrified and in shock. I stood there, telling myself to run, but my legs felt like lead, and I couldn't move. He got out of the front seat and opened the back doors of the van, then repeated, "Get in the van, or else." Luckily for me, just in that moment, I heard a man's voice yell from the hotel right next to us. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The creepy guy told the man to mind his own business. Another guy from across the street started to confront him as well. When he turned around to tell this man to shut up too, I booked it. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my entire life. Somehow I made it back to campus, crying and gasping for air, while people stared at me like I was a lunatic. I told campus security, who took down all the details and told me they would look into it, but I never got another update after. People, please be aware of your surroundings. Don't be like me and believe that just because it's daylight, nothing bad can happen to you. This night started off in the city, but ended deep in the woods. I just wanted to put that out there for some information. I'm going to obscure the locations for personal safety. I'm originally from the Northeast, but I couldn't stand the winters. I went south for college because of this. I was enrolled in my first year of university in the southern part of the US. The university was in a small city town, and going out to drink was the main thing everyone did. I was out with some other guy friends, playing pool at a small dive bar. An older guy walked up to us and started talking, asking if he could get in on a game. I'll refer to him as Brian. I was 22 at the time, and this guy looked quite a bit older, probably in his late 30s or so. We played a few games, and he commented about a bonfire party happening just outside of town. He mentioned there were some girls he worked with hosting it, and asked if we wanted to go with him. My friends declined, but I was single at the time, so I said, sure, why not? As we left the parking lot in his truck, he said we needed to swing by his apartment and grab some liqueur. This is when things got weird. I remember getting in the car, pulling out of the lot, and then pulling up to an apartment complex on the very outskirts of town. The bar was in the downtown area, and we were now far away on the outskirts. I wondered if I'd nodded off on the ride because I couldn't even remember the drive there. I started questioning myself when he said he would go inside, get the booze, take a shower, and change his clothes. He offered for me to come inside too. The inside was completely empty. No furniture, nothing hanging on the walls, just completely open, empty rooms, almost like a model home. He didn't even comment on it though. I asked him if he had just moved in or something. He gave me a weird look, then walked back into the bathroom without saying anything else. I thought about just leaving in that moment when I heard him get into the shower. Something about this situation was really starting to creep me out. I was sizing him up in my head and thought I could at least take him if some weird shit went down. I remembered him mentioning the girls and the bonfire, so I decided to hang around and see where the night went. His shower stopped and he walked out wearing different clothes a few minutes later. He had 2 bottles of whiskey with him and looked at me. Ready? We jumped back in his truck and pulled out. I made a very conscious effort to stay very alert. We left the city limits and headed outside of town on a dark back road. We were still on a main road, but now we were very far away from town. The closest city I knew of was an hour away in the opposite direction. There were fewer and fewer houses as we drove along. The places I did see looked like decrepit old shacks that had been abandoned for years. I had lived here for a few months, but I had never been out this far. We drove for even longer, so far in fact that a few times I had to ask if he knew where he was going. We were in the middle of nowhere now, no houses at all, just thick woods on both sides of the road. I didn't see him reading any directions or maps or anything. I saw a small parking lot with a gas station and a turnoff. A lone streetlight lit that station, only 2 pumps, and they looked ancient. A red neon sign that said 24 hours. We turned off onto this side street and kept on driving. This road was even worse than the main road we'd just been on. No lights at all, very narrow. It twisted and turned, now snaking through the woods. No houses at all, but I would occasionally see a rotting old mailbox every once in a while. We came to the top of a hill where there was a driveway. I again asked if he knew where he was going, and he just chuckled to himself. I was now in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, with a guy I realized I didn't know at all. Fear started to creep in. When we finally arrived at a destination, it was not a house. In fact, it looked like a garage or some sort of industrial building. No lighting inside or around it. No motion lights as we drove up. No cars or other people. "Where is the bonfire?" I made my tone as direct as possible. He indicated just backward through the woods. We drove past this decrepit building, around the back and towards the woods. As we got closer, I could see a very small path. So small the branches scraped along the truck's side. After what seemed like forever, the trail opened into a clearing. I could see a few other trucks and people now. Relief washed over me. I grew up in the city and wasn't used to shit like this, so I started to think that maybe I was just being uptight and needed to calm down a bit. It was past midnight now. We left the bar around 10, so it felt good to finally leave that car. I scanned the whole group but could only see a few girls. A couple of guys were building a fire and trying to get it going. There were about 25 to 30 people here. A guy who was introduced as Mike walked up to us to greet Brian, but he stared at me the whole time. He never once stopped staring at me. In fact, they were all staring at me. Brian said he needed to take the piss and walked off. Mike asked if I wanted a beer. He said to hang tight and walked away. He came back and handed me an open bottle. I said thanks and tried to initiate some small talk, but he simply turned around and walked away. I started to look around, and now I could see something was really off here. There was no music playing, no lights. Nobody was even talking to each other. The people at this party seemed diverse in age. I wondered how these people even knew each other. They were all just standing together, mumbling. Each time I approached a group of people, they would simply stop talking and turn to stare at me. It was extremely uncomfortable. I found myself standing alone, with everyone looking at me, just waiting for Brian to come back. I couldn't see him anywhere. I looked around for his truck too, but now I couldn't find that either. I had just about had enough of this weird shit and was now ready to go. I kept on scanning around, looking for his truck, but it wasn't there. I hadn't heard any vehicle start or go while I was walking around. I turned back towards the bonfire, now seeing everyone standing together, looking at me once more. All 30 people were now in one grouping, and they just stood there, completely silent, unmoving. They just stared at me. The bonfire glowed behind the group, making the moment feel surreal. As I stood there awkwardly, I started noticing their faces were changing. Their expressions rapidly changed from smiling to frowning, their eyes going wide and snarling at me. But once I focused on them, their faces immediately went back to blank and expressionless. Suddenly, they began to walk toward me at a deliberate pace. I turned around and ran. I ran up the path out of the clearing as fast as I could. My adrenaline was surging, and I kept running. I couldn't hear anyone coming up behind me or any vehicles now, but I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to put as much distance as possible between them and me. I started to panic as the trail broke off and went different ways. I didn't remember that from driving in, but I kept on running all the same. Finally, I saw that industrial building through the trees and felt a bit of relief. I stopped just before the edge of the trail. It was late fall, so it was quite brisk out, but now I was burning up. I was wearing flannel and jeans with boots, not exactly great for running. I was sweating like a pig and really needed to catch my breath. The light from the bonfire was not visible anymore through the thick woods. As I crossed the lot and passed the industrial building toward the paved road, lights came on inside. A second wind of adrenaline took hold, and I ran towards the paved road and kept running. My feet felt like lead, and my legs were burning, but I ran as hard as I could. I finally got too tired and moved into the brush to hide and catch my breath. I couldn't see any headlights, so I went back to the side of the road and began jogging. I was on high alert, glancing all around me. When I finally reached the end of the road, which connected back to the main road and the gas station, I went inside that station. There was an old guy sat at the counter watching a small TV. He noticed I looked quite haggard and asked if I was alright. I told him I needed to use a phone. He laughed and asked where I'd come from. I told him I had been out at a party in the woods and just gotten ditched. He gave me a strange look and gestured toward the phone on the wall. I could see he had a gun on his hip and had probably thought I was a tweaker come to rob him or something. There was a phone book, so I called the taxi to come pick me up. An hour later, I was back in my dorm room and went to sleep. I never did see Brian again after. I drove by his apartment complex plenty of times, but never saw his truck parked there. I never saw it around town or back at the bar either. I remember because it was an off-white single-cab Chevy, late 80s model with a skull sticker on the back window and Roman numerals on the forehead. My curiosity got the better of me a few times, and I drove out toward that small gas station. I followed the road to where the shop was and found it. I drove out a couple of times, and each time there was no one there, and it looked completely abandoned. The building looked even shittier in the daytime. I left and drove back to town. I have no idea what to make of the events of that night.